You want, yeah?
Yeah, because initially what we talked about with regards to the workshop activity was to try to think through, in terms of your mutual experience, the relationship between breakdown and breakthrough. Mike wrote this really great article about breakdown in intercultural relations, and what two important philosophers could have done that would enable us to think through more like the mechanics, the dynamics, the nuts and bolts of what happens when two subjects come together and they think they understand each other and they don't, and then in French they say "ça passe ou ça casse," right? It's gonna go through the door or it's gonna break, right? I wonder if you two could talk about a moment through the course of your friendship or collaboration where you kind of realized that you're at a critical point and it was either going to stop there or it was going to continue, and what happened?
Which story should we tell? I can remember one. It wasn't necessarily about our relationship, but it was a place where our perspectives came in really, really significant. And we were talking very similarly about the drug treatment situation in Baltimore City and some of the work that we were actually doing, and kind of which way to go on the project. And I kind of mentioned to Mike that, the word on the street was that there was this major conspiracy, about the powers to be, that when I'm standing on the street corners and talking to the brothers and we kicking it and, they telling me what's on their mind, and, somebody will take another toke of the joint and say, hey man, the man keeping me down, I can't get a job and I can't do this, and so what they were formulating in their head was this major conspiracy theory that was really kind of out there, and from some of the evidence and indicators that they mentioned to me, it was hard not to believe that they didn't believe what they were talking about. And I won't say what other perspective Mike brought in, I let him do that, but there was another perspective that came in that really brought that into some coherency for us in that particular situation, and we were able to take back to the project. Remember that?
I'm trying to remember. I'm old. I can't remember.
It was
Give me a hint, James. I remember the.
What about smart enough to put that kind of theory together?
Oh, about how the government could. Yeah. So James was here now. Yeah, no, I'm not. And being an old cynic who had lived in Washington for a long time, I said, it's an interesting theory, but this government could never get their shit together to pull something like that off. There's no way they could pull that off. And so we started talking about that. And I've hit that too in PG County. PG County. I was asked by the PG County folks, you don't know PG County. Prince George's County is one of the suburban counties of Washington, D.C., and it's undergone a very interesting history because it used to be country western redneck traditionally, and it's now become a major prosperous African-American county in population. So they called me up, and again, it was a nice request for a favor. They were going to have a retreat, and they said, and the treatment people, and they said, would I come up and talk? And the folks in the audience got into that. And at this point, I've been doing some research on histories of drug epidemics, right? And I, in fact, knew that American intelligence had been involved in one way or another in virtually every narcotics epidemic since World War II. And I knew how, I knew why. So that was an interesting conversation because they had the notion this is a plot to keep the black community down. If it isn't heroin, then it's methadone. And so rather than have to even just say they were too dumb to pull it off, right? I could say, well, in fact, they did pull something off. And it was involved with use of narcotic distribution systems as monetary support for our allies.
And at the time, we
In
were
World War II in Vietnam and Central America and Afghanistan. And I can tell you all the stories.
working with the team of other ethnographers.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Rodney, Kenya, and Al,
Yeah.
where we were really trying to figure out how to actually approach folks on the street in order to actually get them in the interventions. And that piece of information, or that dialogue that we had at that particular point, and that level of convergence allowed us to be able to go back to the team and make some decisions about how that we were going to distribute the labor in terms of getting out, and ended up kind of going out into the streets of Baltimore and having a fairly successful encounter in terms of outreach. And we were, because of that level of congruency among the ethnographers, there was 5 of us, right?
Yeah.
And
I wish we'd taped that.
yeah,
But that was something. I mean, the cast of characters is so interesting. The 2 of us, but also Al, who was ran a shelter, a homeless shelter. Rodney, who was a PhD anthropologist. He's currently at Pitt. Oh, he's at Pitt, University of Pittsburgh. And Kenya, who was undergraduate at Hopkins in sociology. Right, she eventually went off to graduate school. But that crew of the 5 of us, like the chemistry was just outstanding. The trust was there, and we could just talk from our different angles about whatever the issue was. Extremely creative. It was like a jazz set, and it's just very, very, almost all the time, really good performance. But one of the things about intersubjective that this brings out is that one of the subjects is often the institution. And so we did a good job as long as we did the work, but that, in my opinion, not out of self-interest, should have been cultivated, developed, and made a centerpiece. But instead, because of the dominant public health funding model and the regulatory structures around National Institute on Drug Abuse, it couldn't really go anywhere except that little collection.
Thank you for reminding us that collaboration relies on trust.
Questions for both of you, particularly for you, James. Then you were put in the doctor's chair. Then you were considered as an expert in public health because you were working within the harm reduction model, and then arriving over there and good cooperation with the owner of the shooting gallery. When we worked as anthropologists within the margins of the society, in this case, illegal activities, and if we go back to this notion of cooperations, who will be the cooperators, other people involved in the research, if we accept the idea that we should develop a large team of people? Then, what about the police? What was your relation with the police? Because I wrote 2 books on the same things here in Montreal, and I'm quite aware of what's happening and the dangers of being present over there in the shooting galleries if you're not covered by the police. Even if, as a visit card, then you say, I work with public health expert and we are there to help people. That's first thing. Second thing, the junkies themselves, the ones who come to inject the drug. Generally we collect this life stories, and that was your first book, and that's very, very important, it's fundamental. But how to incorporate those people as well within the research? Is it feasible up to a certain point? When do we stop? And then this will maybe force to think about who should be the member of a cooperative team if we accept that. And I take this opportunity to say that for the past 35 years that I'm working closely with my wife, we have been a team, really a team. What I discovered after so many years is that we share the same framework. And this is absolutely at one point, I would say, the normal development of a close cooperation, of teamwork. But it raises the questions of diversity within the team. Then what about police? What about the junkies themselves? Not to mention many other players there. Here in Montreal, what I say also, it's something marginal but important, is that the shooting gallery will not remain in place for more than 1 year. It's moving all the time because police with zero tolerance is after those people. As soon as they find out where it's located, then it will disappear. Then we have to move to other places. I'm amazed by the fact that those people have been there during 10 years, which is absolutely incredible.
That's interesting because one of the things that, because of the type of work I do, even in DC, as well as Baltimore, one of the first things that I do to get a sense of the terrain is to do these ride-alongs with the police. And the ride-alongs is where I go to the police station and I say to them, hey, I want to get on a particular shift and I want to ride with you. Because I found out that in most urban situations, the police have more information about the structural issues and where things are happening than probably anybody else. And so getting that sense of who the criminal justice or law enforcement folks in that area was one of the first things that I personally kind of did prior to going in. Now, what I didn't do was go in and say, hey, Mr. Officer, I'm going over here to the shooting gallery. that I didn't do, but I did have a relationship with them. And the other thing is like I say, I'm not a man without a past. And so I didn't want them to come in and kick the door in while I was in there, and then they'd be able to look back in the 40s and find out, hey, this man, maybe he's doing something crooked, So I needed to let them know who I am for real. And so, but then at the same time, while managing that part of things with the bureaucracy, I was managing the relationship with Chief in order to establish some trust, establish some rapport. And then that turns into when I'm sitting down putting my information together for the report that I have to give to folks who are giving me the resources or writing a manuscript, how much of this gentleman's life am I going to expose? And that becomes a real struggle because here was a man who trusted me enough that one day we were walking and talking and he actually took me to his elderly mother's house, to introduce me to her, who introduced me to the family and that kind of thing. And that wasn't part of the research, but it was something I had to do, I felt like I did anyway, in order to maintain my relationship with him. So there were a lot of nuances that I didn't talk about that had to be managed with that relationship because one of the things is that we were living in two different worlds. And we had two different lenses that we were looking at the same world with. And I think I heard yesterday that it was not about converging those worlds, but a matter of finding some common space where we could work those worlds at the same time in order to achieve both of our objectives. Because at the same time, he had an objective working with me. And as well as I had one working with him, and so keeping that out front for me, and then kind of moving through the relationship. And so that police relationship really helped me in terms of keeping some of the things, keeping me in my world, but at the same time not bringing that stuff into his reality.
It's interesting that as I got older, towards the end of my drug career there, I was doing some meetings, some policy kind of meetings more, and where like the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, and some meetings, even the Central Intelligence Agency, were also participants. It wasn't their meeting, but it was all drug-interested folks, right, except for users. And I had the eerie epiphany that the people in the field, that folks like me and James could talk about in a most interesting, compatible way, were the intelligence people. Now, we had slightly different goals, to put it mildly, right? But they were also very sort of ethnographic in their logic and their context and meaning issues. So it was quite interesting. They were used to working with found data. What can I get? Where can I get it? Hey, did you hear that? And trying to put together the pieces of the puzzle and come up with some kind of framework. The second interesting thing about the cops was that a lot of them were as angry as James and I are with American war on drugs policy. For, again, different interests, but there's an alignment here, you see. I mean, there's a lot of cops now that are actively arguing against this and saying this is stupid. You know, this is just stupid. Some of you may have seen the TV show Homicide, Life on the Streets, maybe, or The Wire. If you ever get a chance to see those, they're Baltimore shows by a writer and some collaborators who have worked in the streets, crime reporters and people like that. And they're really pretty good. What do you think? Yeah, they're really pretty good. Well, the story continues because James is now starting a project at George Washington University in the School of Public Health, and he invited me to be part of that. So we'll be back next year to tell you some more. Any other questions or comments?
But can I suggest, do we take another 15, 20 minutes?
What I was going to suggest is that
Would be nice to kind of reflect on this collaborative work and some of the questions that you and Shio raised.
I wanted to, because I put this out as a possibility, I wanted to give the opportunity for people who want to disperse.
Oh, okay.
So, because it's already 3:30.
Hey,
Fourth one.
so it's not bad. May I suggest that one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, what has your story to do with Shio's mushrooms?
Mushrooms are very good drugs.
Good. 1 point for you, but not those.
It has a lot to do with it.
You help.
It's a multinational system.
It wasn't really a question to you. It was meditative. The obvious thing seems to be, well, you're in the business of helping people. She is in the business, like most of us, studying an interesting subject. But actually, you know, sort of on the border of helping those guys who need no help, namely those who make a lot of money. Right? And it looks like we are on opposite sides.
Why are they mutually exclusive?
What is mutually exclusive?
Helping and studying.
Did I say that?
Yeah.
When?
No.
No.
You said we're in the business of helping people.
Yeah.
You all are in the business of studying interesting things like the mushrooms.
I made a distinction.
Yes.
But I didn't say that they were mutually exclusive. I'm looking for the common ground.
The common ground.
What is the common ground?
Actually, the engagement that we can do through this mushroom is not just a business.
I know that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
Business
provocative.
is really rather minor issues. It's
Okay.
more like, for example, I think a lot of the collaboration that we, each members, at least Anna, Michael, and I have in our own field. Anna's case in Oregon, my case in Japan, and also Canada, and Michael's case in Yunnan is more like we are approached by people who are doing environmental protection and forestry management. So that's one issue. And the other thing is Anna and I have worked together is the intervention of the sort of like a mediation of scientific knowledge and the mediating the miscommunication between Japanese-speaking scientists and English-speaking scientists, because it seems to be they have the same object, but they don't really communicate each other. They're passing each other in terms of their exchange of knowledge. So as an anthropologist, sort of we are asked to help them understand what's going on in terms of this gap of communication among scientists. So that's one aspect of how we engage in outside of.
That would be helping them, right?
Yeah.
So you're helping within the context of the research.
Right.
Communication among the different-
But there are just only a few examples. There are potentially a lot more other engagement as we move along.
When you do your work, when you're doing your ethnographic work, don't you also get involved, say, with helping some community issue, something comes up you can help
Maybe,
with?
maybe. But what I wanted to say, we have one huge common denominator. The first thing we want to do is help ourselves. That's the thing. We want to help ourselves, first of all, to make it through the day. I always come back to that. That's our mode of making it through the day. Others do other things. Second, we want to help ourselves to understand the world in which we are. And we want to be, our claim to, our title to glory is that we are the ones who can articulate this kind of understanding. So it becomes available to others. Now the catch is to find a way of making the helping ourselves, to make those ourselves everybody. Not just things, us as opposed to others, but including in the ourselves everybody. That's the catch. That's the whole business about the other and so on. That is, what is the subject ultimately of things happening in the world to us and so on? Is it us and many, many others, or is it us altogether? And this is hopelessly idealist, but it's the only way to remain a realist. If you don't set it that high, we should close shop. I mean, we would be irrelevant. I mean, what difference do we make in the world if we don't believe that? So it is basically, we're helping ourselves.
All right, we have comments or questions here, and here. That's the three stuff. Yeah, you want that.
For me, it has been very instructive afternoon. Because in many respects, I'm thinking about these categories, these concepts, from Western philosophy. We are talking about object, we are talking about subject. Here is Shiho and her collaborators giving agency to the mushroom. Here is Bob's collaborator, dismissing him that this is Cartesian. Here is James, and to some extent Michael, taking a kind of relational approach to talk about the subjects of their inquiry. So in many respects, I remember the structural moment in anthropology, the post-structural moment in anthropology, and conversations with Claude Lévi-Strauss, which George Steiner put together, in which he was making us understand how one cannot really study structure and change at the same time. And then in his conversations with Rick Sweder from Chicago in 1990, he admitting that, look, I really cannot give subjecthood to the objects of my study. They are really the objects of my study. So to some extent for me, these are very troubling and problematic ideas. And I see them as kind of culture bound. They're really part of the Western experience. When we really broaden it and bring in the Hindu view or the Buddhist view or the indigenous people's view, as you were articulating beautifully yesterday, then a different mode of inquiry comes to my attention. When he's really talking about relational way. So when I will talk to my Zuni friends, in different contexts, and Frank Hamilton Cushing in the 19th century had collected that kind of material. And when they talk about democracy and democracy in America and their own kind of democracy and consultative democracy, So they have to consult plants, they have to consult animals, they have to consult different forms of life. And in the kind of folk tales they had collected, human beings asking them by addressing them as grandfather, or as addressing them as mother or grandmother, this relational way of, relating to them and saying, what do you think of it? What do you have to say about it? And here we are, when we have divided the world into what is objective and what is subjective, and what is objective we have inferiorized, put it in a hierarchical relation, and what is subjective is really basically kosher, basically acceptable, superior. And then we really start to look around whatever we are doing in that way. And then here is Parthu Chatterjee, a theorist coming from India, looking at these things and really saying whether you problematize the Westerners' way of looking at the world or not, and saying that, look, in our part of the world, in the way our own thinkers have thought about it, they have privileged the notion of inner and outer. That the world, if you really look at it, are you really looking at it, through how interiority is constructed, what is interior? Or you are really looking at it as something which is external? The Hindu notion of Vahya Vyantar. Vahya is outside, Vyantar is inside. The Hindu notion of also that when the dichotomy between observer and observer is transcended, then you really become one. The idea of what they call to becoming one, or what is the Hindu notion of Atmasat. And then you again look at it from a different way, then what really happens that when that dichotomy disappears, the Hindu teaching is very dialogical, like what anthropologists have been talking about collaboration. And there the pupil asks the question and the guru responds. So the pupil is asking the question that, look, what is the difference between the tree and the beads, the seed? And he says, nothing. So he says, what do you mean? So he says, bring some seed, put it in the warm water, put it in the warm earth, mother earth, womb, put some water on it, wait for a while, it becomes the tree. Is there a difference? Where is the difference? Then the Vedantic idea of what is the divine, Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. So to some extent, when you look at the world in a taxonomic way, in a typological way, as the last 500 years or so, because of Western colonialism and Western hegemony we have been thinking about, then you have one understanding of the world. When you really look at the world from a relational point of view, as the indigenous people have it for a very long period of time, then you really get a different kind of outlook on life. So there is no indigenous society where you have the notion of what is indigenous and what is traditional, or what is traditional and what is modern. The dichotomy between tradition and modern is a feature of being modern. It is not part of any traditional way of thinking. So to a large extent in this hegemonic phase for a very long period of time, we have put ourselves in a superior position and everybody else is the object of our inquiry, and we have put them in a subordinate, inferior position, and we are not willing to learn anything from which is emerging from that context. So unless and until we deconstruct ourselves mentally and try to identify with the people and give them peoplehood, we are not going to get anywhere.
Tell me, this is why I think we're talking about intersubjectivity or collaboration is trying to reintroduce relationality into our epistemology.
Yes.
I mean, Baton himself said it was an epistemological mistake of not having this relational done in the production of knowledge. You go ahead.
It was really just a whole bunch of every one of these talks from Bob's up. They're all really fascinating. Part of the reason to me they were fascinating is because of the kind of fascinating curiosity, like trying to figure out how a $10 mushroom becomes a $100 mushroom. Wondering about whether or not the that nature thing that they're trying to recreate is going to turn into something James Scott described about how you end up destroying that nature accidentally as you try to manage it and perfect it. And just all these things. And you know, I watched The Wire, so when I was hearing you talk about the shooting gallery, I kept hearing people go, "You film me?" And I was wondering if they were doing stuff like that there. And it was like, and then with yours, I was thinking, yeah, it's really fascinating. I never thought about that, but we do listen to music in ways that we don't even know that we're listening to. So to try to figure out how people are listening to music over a long period of time. So I guess all this summarized, to me, it brings back to me that what I get excited about anthropology or ethnography is just this curiosity about these spaces. And then there are all these questions, and you start trying to answer the questions, they lead to more questions, maybe it gets kind of mystical along the way.
Yeah.
It's really, it is incredibly intensely pleasurable to do this kind of stuff. So anyway, it was just a comment, and it was meant to be much shorter than that. And it was way past, it was way earlier on in the discussion. So, yeah.
It's a bit different, but after so many years, when I look at what granting agencies in Canada, it's probably the same in the United States, what they have in mind is not to support individual people. They are pushing towards not only small team, large research center. They want to see many people together. They want to see many people together. It's still possible to get a grant if you are alone, of course. And this has been the case for many, many years. But there is this trend, particularly for young researchers. When I look at my young colleagues, the ones who have joined departments, they are becoming small businesses. They have to be very productive to get a lot of money, then a large team of research and people abroad and here and so on and so on. Then, when we look at history of science, what philosophers of science, one of the most important lessons is that advances in science happen at a certain moment and out of controversies, out of debates. And one of the dangers, I'm not at all against, I fundamentally believe in the fact that science is a collective enterprise, that we collaborate with other people, but one of the artifactual results of pushing too much the disintegration of many researchers together is a kind of a lack of debates. It's quite paradoxical, but this is what is happening. It's a kind of unification of the framework. We lose the debates. We lose the debate. If we have three researchers, independent from one another, working on the same topic, they may approach a topic within different frameworks. And then after that, through journals and meetings like this one, they compete and then they come with their own ideas. Then we have to be very careful, because we may end up with a unique thinking at one point. And second element, and very, very briefly, when I've run during almost 7 years, 30 years ago, a large research team, le Centre d'études de médecine des guérisseurs. We were trying to assess the value of the medicinal herbs and all that. We had a botanist, we had a pharmacologist, physicians, psychologists, anthropologists, a lot of people. But they were independent from one another. They were independent from one another because each discipline has its frame, concept, theories. But at a given certain moment, we had to exchange and provoke the debate. If a team is in a position to maintain within the team real debates, then we may eventually avoid this danger of the unification of the approach of knowledge. The problem of the community do we have? We work with community groups here. Research is not easy. Is it possible for a community group to have researchers and who will participate with us? We are trying that. It's a big challenge, not easy at all. We are moving now towards that. But it raises other sorts of problems. I'm not going to address myself to those problems, but I tell you that it's not easy at all. You work with Amerindians, and you know how difficult it is. I also work with them. They want to be the owners of their data, the interpretation of the data, the papers which are produced and all that. This is another very important issue. And as soon as we talk about this collaboration, we have to look carefully at who are the people involved in the team and what are the, I would say, what do we improve and what we may lose. We may lose a lot. This is not a play, and they may lose a lot as well. This is not a play for, I would say, an appeal to go back to individual research, but individual research has to be present within team research. Otherwise, something will be lost.
At least. But better would be go back to individual research.
Just one word. I mean, when addressing this question of collaborative or cooperative research, I mean, we've not discussed the question of writing. Eventually, who writes the final text? I mean, is it possible to write with several hands? As we say, écrire à quatre mains, or is it just a juxtaposition of different texts? And I think this is also an issue.
That's a huge issue. It's a very big issue. Shio's text is a really good example of one of the ways that. But she even said, we're in what's that?
No, Shio's text is
Yeah,
a good
it's
example.
a great example. But she even said, we're not sure about this. Right? It really is very. When we first met, I said your text. I was thinking that the text is as wild as the mushrooms are. It's a wild text.
How does the mushroom write?
Yeah.
The writing is a big question, but what Gilles said, the rights as well of the data, in a collaboration thing, mostly with indigenous people, this is an issue in itself.
But there are either rights or not. We either respect them or we don't. Those are the two questions. And the first one, are there rights? Can culture be owned? Under what circumstances, in what way, if, who is the owner, what does he do with it? That's the first question of resolve. We can sort of...
Yeah, but you said before, culture is not an entity. We have these manifestations of culture, and that's what we're talking about. Intellectual property rights is based on...
Somewhere, I think anthropology, has created this thing among its indigenous. We have created it. Now they're saying we're guardians of our culture and we own our culture. We don't want to see you anymore. We've created it. Little bit, not totally. Guilty, who talked of guilt?
In a world in which we have copyright, patents and all that, it's sure that at one given point, knowledge of communities, knowledge about nature, knowledge about a lot of things, that will come out. And then people pretend that they have rights. But this is, I do think they have rights on their knowledge. This has been developed. This has been developed. But in the way the law within the World Trade, the agreement, ADPIC agreement on intellectual property today, this is not covered. That's the reason why they impose outside the international laws these things. But do we have the second, what he said emotionally, is the second thing is, if they are right, are we forced to respect those rights?
This is a huge rat's nest. Before you go, I need to just make a couple of quick announcements. For those people who want to look at a map and get advice for cool spots to visit, I'll be here or in the front for the next few minutes. Hold up a second. Hold up. Time out.